Welcome back to BPG TV. My name's Paul Gofton and today we're going to be talking about contaminated sites. Today we'll be covering what you need to check before you start work, safety and health, what you need to do to protect yourself, others and the environment, and what to do if you find contamination on your work site. So what is a contaminated site?
Camera 2.
Let's go over to Connor, one of our contaminated site specialists, who's going to explain it to us.
Land may become contaminated when an activity or industry has released hazardous substances to soil, and this can become a problem for human health and the environment. This is how contamination affects people directly, when you breathe in or eat dust or soil, or through contact with skin. You can also be affected by eating vegetables or livestock grazing on contaminated land, or by drinking contaminated water. You may not know anything about what your land was used for in the past, and contaminants are not always obvious, because you may not be able to see or smell them in the soil. Potentially contaminated land is recorded on a database managed by Environment Canterbury called the Listed Land Use Register.
Great, thanks Connor. As this is a very important subject, we've actually sent Michael out of the office to go down to a work site and find out what's happening out there. Let's go over to Michael.
Thanks, Paul. We're here today with Dave from Geoscience. Dave, why is it important to know what we're dealing with on a contaminated site?
Well, there are two main reasons. One is impact on the environment and the other one is the health and safety risk to the workers. Impact on the environment can come from two areas. One is a chemical impact on plants and animals and waterways, and the other is the physical, with sediment getting into waterways and starving them of oxygen. The health risks include short and long-term risks. The short-term risks are nausea, headaches, vomiting, dizziness on sites, and the long-term risks are more serious, with the likes of cancers and that type of thing.
So Tracy, as an environmental advisor, first things first, where do we start on a site?
That's a good question. If contaminated land is present on your site, it will be mentioned in the contract documents. This is something that's done or identified at the design stage by the client and the engineer. So check your documents carefully when you're preparing your contract management plan, and if contaminated land is a risk, include contaminated land specific risks and controls in your project hazard register. If you're unsure of any aspect of this, we definitely recommend getting advice from a contaminated land specialist.
So we're here with Alwyn from CityCare's environmental team. So we've done our pre-checks and found out that we're working on a contaminated site. What are some of the other precautions we need to take to ensure our health and safety?
Well, basically we need to make sure that ourselves and everyone else on site is safe and protected. So we're going to check the contract documents and hazard register and make sure we identify in our pre-start talks what contaminants we're dealing with so we can protect ourselves accordingly. Basically the protection that we're going to need is we're going to protect our skin, eyes, nose, mouth, make sure we're not breathing anything in or swallowing it. And we'll do that through using overalls to cover our skin, which will be either disposed of or washed before we go home. And also a properly fitting dust mask or respirator. And it's also important that before we have any meals or a smoke that we wash any contaminants that might be on us off. So we'll wash our hands and our face before we have our breaks. And the last thing we need to make sure is that we're not potentially endangering the public, so we'll have appropriate fences and signage to warn them.
Thanks Michael, but what if you check with your local and regional council before you start work, then when you actually start you find contamination? What do you do then?
Yes, excellent question there, Paul. So David, what do you do about a site which has got nothing written down about contamination?
Well, you should always be on the lookout for physical signs of contamination, and this can include buried containers such as oil drums or fertiliser containers, or you can look for general waste such as refuse, municipal refuse, including plastic and wood and metal. There's also oil sheens and stains that you could have on site from hydrocarbons, or the smells. Anything that doesn't smell natural, it smells like petrol, smells like oil or a solvent, can also be an indication of contamination is present.
Can there be invisible contamination?
Yes, they can, and the effects of contamination on people might be the first sign that contamination is on site, and this can include health effects such as headaches, nausea or fatigue. And if any worker on site is experiencing these, then work should stop immediately, so a health and safety representative can come and take gas samples to see what the atmosphere is and what could be causing the problems. Other steps that should be taken as well to protect the workers on site include notifying supervisors and health and safety representatives, or contacting the local council or a contaminated land specialist, such as Geoscience. They'll give you then regulations and advice to follow, and they should be followed and implemented before any further work is started on site.
So Tracy, not only is it important to look after our own health and safety on a work site, but what about our co-workers in sensitive areas such as rivers and streams? Can they be affected?
Yes, they can, Michael, and for that reason it's very important to contain any material that's been stockpiled on site. The best way to do this is to create a bond. A bond can be made using hay bales or silt fence, or if those materials aren't available, you could use earth to make an earth bond. It's also very important to control dust and odour by placing a cover on the stockpile. A cover could be a layer of clean fill or a polythene cover.
So we've talked about health and safety and how to stop contamination leaving the site, but what I want to know now is what do we do with the contaminated soil?
Well, Michael, the most important thing to note is that the type of contaminants in the material will determine the correct disposal destination. The material has to go to an approved facility. So what this means is that the facility has the right controls to deal with the type of contaminants that you're sending to it. So this will eliminate any risk to human health or the environment. It's also very important to cover the material when you're carting it off of site during transportation, and it's also really important to track your waste to ensure that it ends up at the correct destination.
Right, so now we know about the precautions we need to put in place for dealing with a contaminated site, how to deal with erosion sediment control on a site, and how to dispose of a contaminated site soil properly. But what happens if we don't? Paul, maybe you can help us out with that.
If you choose not to follow this advice, you and your business could be fined or prosecuted. That means a maximum of a $600,000 fine or 2 years in prison. And that means a criminal conviction which is going to be with you for the rest of your life.